Back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video I wanted to talk about some really overpaid players from this NBA offseason. And this happens every single year, right? I'm pretty confident this is the third year running now that I've made a video similar to this. As we look back at last offseason, I pointed out guys like Al Horford, which was the obvious one, but then even players like Thaddeus Young, who signed like a 3-year, $40 million deal last year that I thought was an overpay. And in this video, we've got 5 players, some obvious, some not so obvious, that I think are being paid too much money. That doesn't necessarily make it a bad contract considering the context of these different teams, but still, I think that is too much money for the value that they're going to provide to their teams, and that is what we're going to be talking about in today's video. But quickly before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload twice a day, every day, all throughout the NBA offseason, and that includes some team previews coming up here as well. I'm going to do a team preview for every single team in the league, so keep an eye out for that. We're on the push towards 100,000 subscribers, and it looks like we can get there by the new year as well. So if you're enjoying the content, then please consider subscribing. You can also leave a like rating on the video as well. It helps me out a ton, gets the video out to more people on YouTube, and lets me know that you're enjoying the content as well. And you can check me out at the various socials at the bottom of the screen. And with all those things said, let's go ahead and begin the list of my most overpaid players so far in the 2020 NBA offseason. And for me, I'm going to start the list with a bit of a controversial one, really 2 controversial ones. And the first one is Davis Bertans, 5 years, $80 million for Bertans. And I don't want to misconstrue this as, hate on this guy as a player. I'm really happy that he got this much money, and it's just a cool story to go from a guy that was basically a salary dump move by the Spurs last offseason to now being someone that is worth a ton of money. And certainly he's a valuable player. One of the best shooters in the entire league, can really score the ball because of the volume and the efficiency at which he shoots from three-point range. My problem with the contract number, and I'll just go ahead and tell you that number 2 on this list is Joe Harris, because there's very similar reasonings here, and there's no point in me repeating myself for 2 different entries here. Bertans and Harris, Harris signed 4 years, 75, Bertans 5 years, 80. I think for the context of these specific teams, it makes sense, because for the Wizards, they didn't want to lose Bertans in free agency for nothing. They decided not to trade him during the season because they wanted to keep him on this roster because of the spacing that he provides, so they re-signed him to a big deal. And for the Nets, Joe Harris is going to be an important player for them because, again, of the spacing that he provides, especially on a team that has so much star power moving forward, you need that spacing. And shooting is an incredibly valuable skill set now in the NBA. We all know that. But paying this much money for Harris specifically, almost $20 million a year, for what are basically shooting specialists, and yes, they can move around, they can, do some other things, but for the most part, it's shooting, feels like a big number for me. And all it takes is a down shooting year, or them to just kind of be off their game a little bit, be in a slump, for them to suddenly not really be that valuable to your team. And it's just because of the specialized nature of their games that causes this to be a bit of an overpay here for me. It's not egregious. It's not like the Al Horford thing last year. It's not as bad as really any of the other contracts on this list. I think every other player on this list is more overpaid than these first 2 guys, despite the fact that this list is not in any particular order. But I did feel the need to mention it because I think these are deals that are getting praised because of the context of the situation. I'm glad Joe Harris didn't leave. I'm glad Bertans got as much money as he did. But when you're looking strictly at the type of players that they are, I think it's a bit of an overpay. Now we move on to number 3 on the list, and one that I don't think a lot of people are talking about, and it's Jordan Clarkson. 4 years, $52 million to return to the Utah Jazz. And at the end of the day, this isn't a ton of money. It's like $12 or $13 million a year, but it still feels like a lot for a guy in Jordan Clarkson that had an important role for Utah, but I'm not sure is worth this kind of money. So they brought him in at the deadline, and he was good for them, especially off the bench as a perimeter playmaker, adding a little bit more versatility to their lineups to where they're not always relying on Donovan Mitchell or Joe Ingles or Mike Conley at times to be creating the offense. A little bit more explosiveness with their bench unit, and I get that. But every time that we've seen one of these types of deals, I feel like it hasn't worked out. The one that comes to mind here is Will Barton for the Denver Nuggets, who, yes, he's had some injury issues and things like that, but he signed a similar deal for them as kind of that explosive scorer outside of everybody else that they already have, kind of the extra offensive guy when you really need, a handful of buckets in a big game. And I just don't know that Jordan Clarkson is a guy that I want on my roster to fill that role. He doesn't provide much else outside of scoring, and if he's having an off night, he doesn't help your basketball team, and sometimes he can tank the game for you just because the playmaking and the decision making is not quite there. So for me, 4 years, 52 is a lot. Again, though, specific to the Jazz situation, they weren't going to get a Jordan Clarkson caliber player on the free agency market just because they don't have the cap space for that. But it feels like a big number, especially considering the fact that Ingles, Mitchell, and Rudy Gobert are all going to need new contracts soon. Mitchell obviously already signed the max, so he is, locked up. But his number is going to go from like $4 million this year to like 30 next year, and then Gobert and Ingles will need new contracts as well. So with those big numbers on the horizon, understanding it's a new ownership group in Utah that, isn't really worried about spending, that still feels like a lot for someone like Jordan Clarkson given the situation in Utah. And I do think that he is going to be quite simply overpaid. Second to last now on the list is one that, I don't know, you guys might have noticed. I might have talked about this guy earlier in the week. It's Marcus Morris. This is a guy that when I found out about the deal, I was live on stream, and I honestly thought it was a typo. I honestly thought that the 4-year, $64 million deal, I honestly thought it was cut in half. I was like, oh, so it's 4 years, 32, it's just a typo. No, it was a real number, 4 years, 64. And it's not that Marcus Morris is a bad player, right? He can compete on defense, he can make some shots, provides a little bit of scoring ability in the, in the mid post and the mid range, and shot well in the postseason last year. Shot over 40% from three in the playoffs. It's just like, this is the guy that continually shows this habit to completely hijack the offense. He did it in Boston. He did it with the Clippers as well. And he always seems to think that he's the best perimeter guy on the team. Even with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, even with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, he has this habit of just hijacking the offense. And I don't want to pay that guy what he's about to be getting paid. Now, is he worth something on the open market? Of course he is. He's definitely a valuable player. He's a guy that can play on both ends of the floor. And was a priority for the Clippers. And again, you don't want to lose Kawhi and PG next year. You don't want to let Marcus Morris just leave for absolutely nothing. So it makes sense to bring him back. But if you're just strictly looking at the value that he provides to the team compared to how much he's being paid, this is absolutely an overpay for me. It's not egregious. It's not like the Al Horford thing. It's just frustrating for the Clippers specifically when you look at what they lost this offseason and then what they're paying to bring back Marcus Morris. Considering what is on the horizon for them next offseason, it's still frustrating for me and absolutely an overpay. And last up now is the most egregious overpay the entire offseason. Maybe one of the worst free agency contracts that we've seen since the historic summer of 2016. And it's Gordon Hayward going to the Charlotte Hornets. It's 4 years, $120, $30 million a year for Charlotte. They have to stretch Nick Batum's contract just to be able to make this work, unless there's some other deal that has occurred that I'm unaware of that has created this cap space for them. And I gave, a rationale in a video yesterday about why this could actually make sense for them. And I stand by that. But strictly when you're looking at the amount of money that Gordon Hayward is going to be being paid and the length of the contract, it's obviously an overpay. I think it's pretty much on the same level as the Al Horford number. It's just that Hayward is a much better fit in Charlotte than Horford ever was going to be in Philly. So I don't think his value is going to dip the way that Horford's did. And there's a possibility that he returns to all-star caliber form in a situation in Charlotte where they're going to be asking him to do more than they would have in Boston. But just based off what we've seen from Hayward, the injury history, things like that, $30 million a year is a huge number, and it's a little bit comical considering the fact that the Hornets are just now getting off the Batum number as well from that huge contract that they signed him to, and now they're bringing in another, injury history guy at the 3 spot for $30 million a year. So, I mean, it's possible that Hayward shoots 40% from three next year, averages a couple assists a game, 20 points per game, and is really good for Charlotte and looks like he's possibly worth $30 million. And I understand that there needs to be a bit of an overpay here for Charlotte to bring in players like this. And I think, honestly, if you ask them, they would probably admit that this is an overpay and a pretty intentional one. But at the end of the day, it is still a huge number and a surprising number that Charlotte brought Gordon Hayward in on. And that's the biggest overpay for me of the entire offseason. And honestly, as you look at this full list, none of these numbers outside of the Hayward one are really all that gross. We've definitely had worse ones. Again, going back to the Horford thing, going back to the summer of 2016, a lot of teams were actually pretty smart about the contract numbers they were bringing players in on. Now, to be fair, this was a team-friendly market this offseason because there weren't very many teams with salary cap space, which meant the teams were trying to facilitate sign-and trades in order to bring in players, and that just makes the contract negotiations that much more difficult. So for me, I want to give the teams credit for being smart, but some of them couldn't help but be smart because they simply didn't have the money to spend in the first place. So it makes sense that we didn't see as many huge contracts this offseason as we have in the past, but there were still some big ones that, in my opinion, were definitely overpaid. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.